Ezt a videót Timothy Snyder, a Yale Egyetem professzora csinálta, és én csináltam hozzá egy magyar nyelvű feliratot, mert annyira fontosnak találtam. Lássuk, hogy mit mond.
Hi, I'm Timothy Snyder. This is the latest in these little chats about what's going on at the moment that we're doing under the heading Timothy Snyder Speaks. It's the 15th of May. What I'd like to talk to you about today is, well, let's just be direct with one another, how the internet is making you into a fascist. So that may seem like a startling claim, but let me try to ground it in a sense of history, in a sense of what's been going on in the last 20 years. The internet is a new communications technology. And what new communications technologies do is they radically change politics in unpredictable ways. To use the popular Silicon Valley word for it, they disrupt. And the thing about disruption is that it's real. So in the last 15 years or so, when we've been using the word disrupt, what we mean is, hey, like, let's do this great, cool thing that's going to disrupt the world of the grown-ups. But there is no world of the grown-ups. There's only the real world. And new communications, or to put it a different way, there are no grown-ups. New communications technologies actually disrupt everything. And if you're going to disrupt, you have to have some sense of responsibility and some sense of history about what this means. So the historical example is the printing press. Now you might think, well, the books are the least disruptive thing in the world. How could books possibly cause trouble? Well, they seem calming now, but when the book was invented, or rather when the printing press was invented, it was unbelievably disruptive. It disrupted, for example, Europeans' relationship to God. It disrupted their relationship to one another. It led to about 150 years of religious war in which a third of the population of Europe was killed. And then we had the Enlightenment. And then it became clear what books really ought to be. And then authors and texts were reconciled, and something called copyright was invented. And now we have the book as we understand it today. But let's just remember, when the book was invented, it caused 150 years of religious war. That gives us the background we need to ask about the internet. Because of course the internet, when it was invented, came with a whole lot of happy talk. A whole lot of really silly, ahistorical, self-indulgent, idiotic happy talk about how this new technology was going to make us more rational and was going to connect us and do all these very nice things. I just want to point out that there's no particular reason historically to believe that that happy talk is going to be true. With communications technologies, you have to recognize they're going to be disruptive. What am I going to do to manage that disruption? If you don't acknowledge that they're going to be disruptive and you just say, hey, everything's going to sort itself out because we're young and we don't know any better, then you're going to have really big problems. And so let me suggest that the evidence from the present suggests that there have been problems and that this happy talk has been unjustified from the beginning. So let me start gently with simple correlations. Internet penetration in the last dozen years has shifted from about 20% of the world to about 60% of the world. That is to say, a dozen years ago, roughly a fifth of the world had access to the internet. Today, the figure is more like 60%. Those 12 years have been a catastrophe for democracy. Each of those 12 years, authoritarianism has risen and democracy has declined around the world. That's according to the measures of Freedom House, which is an American and a very traditional institution. It's not some crazy left-wing anti-internet conspiracy. It's people who have been collecting data on this for a very long time. So the more internet we have had around the world, the worse democracy has done. The success stories of democracy, by the way, in the last few years have been in Africa, which is, you guessed it, the continent with the lowest internet penetration. So that's a very strong correlation to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is generation. So there is exactly one generation which has been raised on the internet, the generation which is coming of age now, which is in its 20s. That generation is most hostile to democracy in the US, and for that matter in Europe, of any generation since we started taking opinion polls. So the internet has raised a generation which is hostile to democracy. A third correlation would be intervention. if you consider what happened in the US in 2016, what tool did the major right-wing power in the world, Russia, use to try to push American politics in a certain direction? Yes, precisely the internet. Now, you might be saying, well, those are all just correlations. They don't prove causes. And that's true enough, but those are very strong correlations. The fact that the dozen years when the internet has penetrated the world have been a disaster for democracy, the fact that the only generation raised on the internet is in favor of authoritarianism, and the fact that the internet is the weapon of choice for countries around the world who are trying to push politics to the right, those are very strong correlations. I think they're strong enough to at least suggest that the happy talk at the beginning was completely unjustified, and to move us to ask, well, how does the internet actually work on our minds? Or in my terms, what is it about the internet which just might be making you, me, us, all of us, just a little tiny bit more fascist than we were before? Well, the first point is factuality. If you're going to have a democratic regime, if you're going to have democracy, you need some kind of realm of facts. If you don't have facts, it's very hard for people to have conversations about what policy is going to be. It's also very hard for people to challenge leaders, because classically, factuality is the weapon of the weak by which citizens can hold their leaders to account. The internet has not been particularly helpful on the score of factuality for two reasons. The first is that it works by way of distraction. Because most of the internet works on some kind of advertising model, it divides up your attention into the smallest possible unit, which can be sold to advertisers, which makes it very hard for you to concentrate. The other reason why the internet works against factuality is that it tends to affirm what you think already. This is the way Google searches work. It's also the way most social platforms work. Algorithms decide what it is that you like to hear, what things you keep coming back to, and give you more of the same, and as a result, push you further in your opinions. Now, why is that so bad? That's bad because the difference between authoritarianism and democracy is the difference between hearing what you want to hear and being able to register facts. Sometimes there are just facts in the world that you don't want to hear, but you have to deal with them, like that a loved one has cancer, or like that there's global warming. You know, there are things out there in the world that we may not like, but if you're going to address them, you have to know that they're out there. In order to have the whole cycle of democracy, better policy, you have to have facts. If you just get used to hearing what you want to hear, then you're not going to care about democracy, because why, right? All you want in life is for someone to affirm what you want to hear, which leads me to the second way that the internet is making all of us just a little bit more fascist, which is the politics of us and them. Jason Stanley has a new book coming out about how fascism works, and the subtitle is precisely The Politics of Us and Them. Us and them is fundamental to how fascism works. What fascism does is it says that there is a nation, there are the people, the real people, and then there are the outsiders, the aliens, the refugees, the Jews, the people who are against the real people. And it reduces politics to a struggle between the us and the them. Now, the internet, unfortunately, tends to move us in that direction, because as we move away from factuality and towards the things that we just want to believe, we find ourselves in groups with other people who want to believe these things. And we're tempted to think, oh, the people who believe other things, they're not just wrong, but they're not us, right? Because once we lose the distinction between what's real and what we want to believe, if we think what's real and what we believe are the same thing, then those other people who don't believe the stuff we think, they're not only wrong, but they're the enemy, right? So this once you lose factuality, you lose the ability to have a citizenry. You lose the ability to have this kind of discussion, because if you don't have the difference between, you know, what I want to think and what I think, then the people who think the things that aren't the things you think, they're not only wrong, they have bad faith. They're out to destroy the country. And so in this way, the internet unfortunately leads us to a politics of us and them. One interesting way this works is that the them is largely fictional. So the more time you spend on the internet, the less time you're spending with other people. And so the enmity that you have is directed against people who you don't know or who don't in some sense really exist. A good example of this is fear of refugees. People are more afraid of refugees if they live in places where there are no refugees. But of course, they're seeing refugees on the internet, and images of refugees are being pitched to them on the internet to make them afraid. The same goes with race relations. So one of the things which goes wrong with the internet is that it takes you away from commerce, from interaction with real people, and puts you in a space where you're being invited to be afraid of refugees or people of other races or whatever it might be, and you're spending time with those fearsome images rather than spending time with actual people who are always more complicated and always a bit more like us than perhaps we would like to think. The third way that the internet makes us all a bit more fascist is that it moves us towards a politics of spectacle. So the way fascism works is that instead of a leader promising you policy and grounding that policy in facts, the leader gives you spectacle. The leader gives you a myth. The leader gives you a story. The leader gives you a narrative. And the key to spectacle is that you want it, right? You want someone to come from somewhere great and tell you a big story. You don't want to criticize it. You don't want to think about whether it's true or not. You want to go for that spectacle. And the internet, unfortunately, is chiefly a spectacle. Not all of it, I know, right? But much of the way the internet works is that it draws you to something which is there for aesthetic reasons, right? Which speaks to what you want to hear, which hits the part of your brain which aren't entirely rational, and gets you used to this kind of constant aesthetic, emotional flattery. And that changes the kind of what you expect from government, and also it makes it easier for certain kinds of people to govern, right? So it pushes us towards wanting a leader who's going to act the way the internet acts, who's going to constantly distract us, who's going to tell us what we want to hear, and who's going to use precisely the internet, for example, Twitter, to keep himself going. Which leads me to the fundamental reason why the internet really does undermine democracy and the rule of law, and really does push us towards fascism and totalitarianism generally. And that is that it collapses the difference between the public sphere and the private sphere. Now, generally, when people talk about the public sphere and the private sphere in the internet, they're talking about privacy. They're talking about the way the internet collects data about all of us and uses that, and then uses that data invisibly to shape the way our lives work in the three-dimensional world. That's very important. Maybe I'll talk about that another time. But what I mean is something which I think is probably more important than that, which is the way that the internet allows you to destroy the difference between the public and the private. Because you see, every notion of democracy, and for that matter, every notion of individuality, depends upon the assumption that there's you, right? You have your own private, subjective, emotional life, and then there are other people who have their own private, subjective, emotional lives, but then there's something called the public sphere, a sphere where things are true or not true, where it's raining or it's not raining, where the world is round or it's not round, where climate change is happening or it's not happening. A world which is public in the sense that all of us from our specific subjective positions can look at that world and say, okay, it's raining, it's not raining, should we use umbrellas or not? What the internet does is it allows you individually to overcome and indeed destroy that difference between private and public. Because what you can do is you can take your subjective starting point, and by way of the internet, everything that you want to think, everything that you want to feel can overwhelm that actual world around you. So this is true in terms of time. Many people now spend more time on the internet than they do in the actual three-dimensional world, but it's also true of subjectivity and objectivity. That is, what you feel, what you would like to be true, slowly starts to overwhelm what's actually true. No matter what you think, you can find people or at least entities on the internet who will affirm that version of reality. And eventually you get to a point where you're sure it's the internet stuff which is right, as opposed to the real world stuff which is right. And when you talk to people in the real world, you'll dismiss them. You'll think that they're less important than what you're getting over the internet. Now, why do I talk about public and private sphere in this connection? It's because if you don't acknowledge the world out there, right? If you don't acknowledge that there are people who can tell you about the weather or about climate change or about gravity or astronomy or whatever it is, if you start to think that you're the expert on everything because you spend lots of time on the internet, that means you're no longer acknowledging the world, right? And that no longer acknowledging the world, I'll just put it very directly, that's fascist. The notion that like everything is about a myth, where everything is possible because you think it's possible, where there are no experts, there are no so-called elites, there are no authorities on the world. It's all about how you feel. It's all about your will. That's fascist. And that makes you vulnerable to precisely the people who provide the best spectacle. It makes you vulnerable to the politics of us and them because you're going to be drawn to the people who have similar myths. It means you're comfortable in this world without factuality. Okay, so I've drawn this picture very darkly, but in the end I want to come back to where I started at the beginning, which is that this is all historical. It's not that tech is good or bad. It's not that the book is good or bad. It's not that the internet is good or bad. It's that communications technologies fundamentally disrupt, and it's up to us as citizens or as users of these technologies just to be aware of this basic reality of history and politics, that the internet has been unbelievably disruptive. Once we recognize that, once we put aside the happy talk and recognize the internet's here to stay, but that we have to do something about it, then of course there are things that we can do. There's no reason why the internet has to drive us towards fascism or totalitarianism. The idea that technology must have some consequence is just as stupid as the idea that it has no consequences. The idea that it must be bad is just as dumb as the idea that it must be good. It's disruptive. What are we going to do about it, and how quickly? Well, there are a couple of things that are pretty obvious that one can do about it. In your own life, there are very simple things you can do. You can use the internet less often, right? 20 or 30 minutes a day. You can intervene in ways which bring the real world into the internet. So for example, if you're going to use the internet, start with newspapers, start with investigative reporters, and post their stuff on your social media platform, rather than letting the social media platform tell you what you should be reading. You choose, right, what you're going to be doing. Or maybe most basically, if you use the internet, try to use it in a way which encourages other people to get off the internet, right? Using the internet makes perfect sense as a platform for social organizing, for protests. Use it that way. So there are things we can do as individuals which actually will be good for our own political ethics and good for other people around us. And of course, there are also fixes which can be done out there in the tech world. It's just not true that the internet has to be exactly the way that it is. There are basic things that there are simple things that can be done. Like for example, as Reddit is doing, you can have little flags which say, if you're using this source, you might want to check your facts because this source is a little bit suspicious. Or if we think a little bit bigger, why don't we imagine social platforms where we can choose our own algorithms? So for example, today I want to be fooled and I want you to tell me all the things I think anyway, but maybe another day I want to just follow investigative reporters, or another day I want to be challenged, right? Why can't we have buttons on the dashboard where we choose different algorithms as opposed to it always being the algorithm which is telling us the stuff that we want to hear already, right? That's a choice. It's a choice that we're all making, but it's a choice. We should acknowledge it as such. And then at a level of policy, there's some pretty basic things that we could do. Like we could acknowledge that, for example, fake news is less expensive than real news, that fake news has a competitive advantage over real news because people who write fake news don't actually have to do any reporting. And then therefore that's an argument for the government to subsidize real news, i.e. investigation. We could say that the production of fiction on a massive scale is an externality, the same way that the production of pollution is an externality, and we could internalize those costs by taxing the huge internet companies just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, and then using those taxes to recreate local news. Local news is very important in all of this because when people have local news, they believe that it's about them, and then that helps them believe that other news might be real, that investigation might be real, and so on and so forth. So there's some policy fixes as well. But the fundamental thing is to recognize that we're in history. Technology doesn't stop history or start history. It's not automatically good. It's not automatically bad. It is what we make of it. It's here, but if we just treat it as something which is automatically has to be the way that it is, then we should recognize that the way that it is pushing us in political directions that we might not want to go. Once we recognize that, then we have a chance to start acting and make a difference. I'm not going to claim that the internet can be made all good or all bad. All I'm going to say is that at the end of the day, humans have to look at it and make decisions about how it's going to work. Because the way that it's working now, unfortunately, is not at all the way that it was